Lecture 11. Libertarian Free Will.
Last lecture, we saw how a certain view of time, a certain temporal ontology, is incompatible with free will. If the future exists before it occurs, then it seems we cannot be free because we cannot do otherwise than we will do. We saw that this temporal ontology follows simply from the fact that there are true propositions about the future, but I also mentioned that there are other reasons for accepting such a temporal ontology that have to do with relativity theory. We will discuss those later, but for now, there are other arguments and facts that threaten our free will, and it is those that I want to explore today. But before we do, we need to get a more definitive grasp on human free will. As I mentioned last lecture, the kind of free will that we are talking about is not political freedom. We have more or less political freedom depending on what laws are on the books. But that kind of freedom is the concern of the political philosopher, not the metaphysician. The human free will the metaphysician is concerned about is your ability to choose the actions you choose. For example, you do not have the political freedom to rob a bank. That is illegal, and if you do, the police will track you down and throw you in jail. But you do have the ability to choose to rob a bank. That is a power you do have, or at least that you assume that you have when you assume that you have free will. Free will is hard to define, but we do have some pretty strong intuitions regarding what is required to possess it. For example, it seems clear that you cannot freely choose to do something if it is not possible for you to choose any other thing. The freedom to choose requires alternate possibilities. This intuition seems obvious given that this is the very assumption that we make when we are deciding which choice to make. For example, suppose you are at a restaurant trying to decide what to eat. In the very process of making a decision, you assume that you could have any item on the menu. If there was only one possibility, if the waiter handed you a menu with only one item on it, a turkey sandwich, then you would have no choice. Or rather, you would have one choice, a turkey sandwich. You cannot freely decide to order a turkey sandwich when that is the only thing that you can order. This is the libertarian requirement for free will. Again, don't think of it in political terms. In metaphysics, the libertarian notion that humans are free suggests that free will requires alternate possibilities. There is actually a wealth of literature on this topic, and the libertarian notion of free will has undergone significant nuanced revisions. For example, it is often said that in order to freely choose to do something, it must be possible to not do that thing. In other words, to do otherwise. But that's not quite right. Suppose that you are in a room where the only door is locked from the outside, yet you do not realize that it is locked. You can, it seems, freely choose to stay in the room, even though you can't really do anything but stay in the room because the door is locked. If you stay, say, because you want to have a conversation with someone in the room, you freely choose to do so. But notice that this seems to be the case because, even though leaving the room is not an option, choosing to leave the room is, even though such a choice would be frustrated by a locked door. So usually the libertarian notion of free will is defined in terms of alternate choice. In order to freely choose to do something, it must be possible for you to not choose to do that thing. We can go back and forth on a few counterexamples to nuance the definition, but I actually think this is the best one. The one I arrived at by going back and forth on the arguments about free will's definitions, so that's what we're going to go with. But for simplicity, we will remind ourselves of this definition by simply saying that free will requires alternate possibilities. Now, we've already considered one reason to think that we are not free, that there are no alternate possibilities. If the future exists before it occurs, then the future is already written, and we can choose to do no other actions besides those that are already written on the timeline. But maybe you are not impressed with this argument. Maybe you're willing to embrace multi-valued logics. Still, there are other reasons for concluding that we don't have free will. To understand the first reason, we need to fully understand the concept of determinism. A deterministic system is one in which all events that occur are dictated by the laws of physics, and what they entail must occur given a previous state of affairs. The example I like to use is a billiard table. It is a deterministic system. Let's say you've racked up the billiard balls and you hit the cue ball toward them. What will happen next is completely and totally determined by the laws of physics. The velocity and spin of the ball, the location and mass of the other balls, the size of the table, these factors determine what will occur. Which, if any of the balls will go in a pocket, where all the rest of the balls will end up, and what path they take to get there is completely decided once you have sent the cue ball on its way. In fact, if you knew all of this information and were really good at math and really fast, you could actually figure out what's going to happen before it occurs. Just crunch the numbers, given the initial state, and boom, you would know. Now, looking at it, it would seem random. But that's only because we can't intuitively do such calculations by simply looking, and most of the nuanced information that would be required is not available to us. But if we knew everything about the billiard table and the laws of physics, and we were fast enough, we could figure it out. One hallmark of a deterministic system is that if it's reset, it repeats. Put the balls in the exact same configuration, hit the cue ball from the same location in exactly the same way, and you will get the same result. A determinist is someone who believes that the universe is a deterministic system. Think of the universe's fundamental particles as the billiard balls, and the universe as a giant three-dimensional pool table on which these particles interact with one another. How these particles interact with one another is completely governed and determined by the laws of physics, and everything that happens in the universe is ultimately just the movement of such particles. So if I knew the location and velocity and spin of all the particles in the universe right now, I could just do the math and figure out where all the particles will be in the next moment in time. And given that I would then know the location, velocity, and spin of all the particles in the next moment, I can crunch the numbers and figure out what the next moment would be like, and then the next, and then the next. I could figure out the entire future of the universe. In fact, if the universe is deterministic, if I knew what the universe was like the moment after the Big Bang, I could figure out the entire history of the universe. Think of the Big Bang as you hitting the cue ball with your cue stick. It sets things in motion, and everything that happens after is determined by what happened in that first moment. A philosopher named Laplace imagined a demon with this kind of knowledge and power. A demon that knew everything about the initial state of the universe, was really good at math, and was able to figure out the history of the universe before it occurs. He's called, not surprisingly, Laplace's demon. To understand why and how this view of the universe threatens free will, you need to appreciate that you are made up of material particles. Your actions are the movements of matter in the universe, and you do not violate the laws of physics. Ultimately, as we discussed in the first few lectures, everything you do is a result of your brain activity, how your neurons are wired and fire. But your brain is a physical organ, whose activity is dictated by the laws of physics. So how your neurons are wired and fire is causally determined by how they were wired and fired in the previous moment, which was caused by how they were wired and fired the moment before that, which was caused by the moment before that, etc., etc. We could trace the causes of the movement of the particles of your brain all the way back to the Big Bang. But obviously, you had no control over what occurred then, and so you have no control over what you do now. Perhaps we can fully appreciate how a deterministic view of the universe threatens free will by realizing that if it is a deterministic system, it is repeatable. If you set things up exactly as they were set up before, if the Big Bang happened just as it did before, the same thing would happen again. The universe would unfold exactly as it had before. So clearly, nothing else but what is causally determined by the initial state of the universe, including your actions, could occur. So clearly, you can't do otherwise, and thus you are not free. So we can see why, if the universe is deterministic, we are not free. The deterministic view of the universe was very popular among scientists more than a century and a half ago. And that was because it had the most evidence at the time. But it turns out this view is false. Now you might wonder why I just spent so much time articulating it if it's false, but understanding why determinism is incompatible with free will is important for understanding why our current understanding of the universe is also incompatible with free will. What proved determinism false was quantum mechanics. We'll be covering that in more detail later on in the course, so we'll leave the specifics for then, but in general, what quantum mechanics discovered that threw determinism into disarray was two things. One, there are some events that happen at the quantum level, the atomic and subatomic level, that are not determined, that are literally uncaused. Their occurrence is not dictated by an earlier physical state or the physical laws. Those events, called quantum events, just occur. Their occurrence is not predictable. For example, when a radioactive atom, such as uranium, will decay is completely unpredictable. The event of its decay is uncaused. And its unpredictability is not a result of our ignorance. There is literally no information or laws that determine when it will decay. When it decays, it just does. In addition, a discovery by the German physicist Werner Heisenberg taught us that on the subatomic level, individual particles, such as electrons, do not have both position and momentum simultaneously. In fact, they cannot have both position and momentum simultaneously. It is mathematically impossible. Further, they don't have either position or momentum until they are measured. And which property they end up possessing, position or momentum, is determined by which property you decide to measure for. All subatomic particles are in a probabilistic flux, called a probabilistic wave function, until they collapse into a particular location or momentum, but not both, by a measurement. Since the determinist suggests that the location and momentum of every particle in the universe at a given time is determined by the location and momentum of the particles of the universe the moment before, given the laws of physics, well, you can see how quantum mechanics throws a monkey wrench into that theory. It's hard for that to be true if subatomic particles usually don't have location or momentum and can't have both. But quantum mechanics doesn't save human free will for a couple of reasons. Even though determinism is clearly false on the quantum level, it could still be true on the level of larger things. For example, if you have 100 uranium atoms, you can be virtually certain that 50 of them will decay during the next half-life. You don't know which individual atoms will decay, but at least 50 of them will. So it is possible to make a deterministic prediction about the larger system, even though it's impossible to make a deterministic prediction about any individual part of that system. Basically, all the quantum randomness at the quantum level gets averaged out on the level of larger objects. So it seems that determinism is still true on a larger scale. And so, since your brain is clearly a larger system, it's likely that all the quantum randomness within it gets averaged out and your behavior is deterministically predictable. But for argument's sake, let's say that's not true. Let's say that some quantum events don't get averaged out. For example, lay your hand down on a table and move a finger, either your index finger or your middle finger, you choose. I'll give you a second. Did you freely choose to move the finger you moved? Let's say that there was some quantum wave function in your brain and some electron is about to collapse into a particular location. Let's say if it collapses one way, you would choose to move your index finger, and if it collapses another way, you would choose to move your middle finger. According to quantum mechanics, which location it will collapse into is completely undetermined. It's uncaused. It could not be predicted even in principle. Given what finger you moved, we could figure out which location the electron took on. Did you thus freely decide which finger to move? No, because you had no control over what location the electron took on. You had nothing to do with it. It was uncaused. It was random. And random uncaused events are no more free than determined ones. So our current view of the universe as dictated by quantum mechanics, even though it falsifies the deterministic view of the universe, is just as much of a threat to free will as determinism. Ultimately, it seems that in order for you to have free will, your actions must be up to you. But they are not up to you if they are determined or if they are random. For this reason, a lot of people try to defend the soul hypothesis in order to defend the notion of free will. It seems that only if our soul is magically reaching out from beyond the physical world to determine what actions we take are we really free. But we've already discussed the problems with the soul hypothesis numerous times. Just recall, the philosophical arguments for it fail, the ones against it are persuasive, the soul hypothesis violates the laws of physics, and is falsified by neuroscience. We know that all our mental events, including our decisions we make, are a result of the neural activity of our brains. Which brings us to the second threat to free will, what we have learned from neuroscience. Now, we have already seen that neuroscience threatens free will by calling into question the soul hypothesis, one place that free will might find solace. But other discoveries in neuroscience question our free will even further. One of my favorite examples is Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome is best known for causing people to uncontrollably shout out profanities in inappropriate situations, often out of nowhere for seemingly no reason. But uncontrollable profanity is just one of the many behavioral tics that a Tourette victim can suffer from. Some people snap their fingers, some people click their tongue. It can be almost anything. The fact that Tourette syndrome exists threatens free will, because if humans truly had free will, there would be no such disease. If you didn't want to continually shout out profanities in inappropriate situations, or snap your fingers or whatever, you could simply choose not to do it. But this is not the case with those who suffer from Tourette's. They want to stop. Oh, how they want to stop. Their condition and its symptoms can cost them their job, their marriage, but they can't stop. And the reason they can't is something is abnormal in their brain. The basic story is this. Impulses to do such things arise from our limbic system and actually occur in most people. But our frontal cortex can counteract such impulses, literally damping them down by sending inhibitory signals from the cortex back down to the limbic system. In people who suffer from Tourette's, the inhibitory signals are not generated, or usually simply cannot be transmitted back to the limbic system. One of my favorite cases comes from a chapter in Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. The chapter is entitled Witty Ticky Ray. Ray suffered from Tourette's and had a wide variety of tics. Not only would he shout out profanities, but he had a number of other bodily tics. Interestingly, he was sometimes able to use them to his advantage. He was a phenomenal ping pong player. His tics would make him do moves that not even he would suspect, and they were almost completely unreturnable. In addition, as a jazz drummer, sometimes his tics would cause him to hit the drums in an unusual way, but he would then turn that into an improvised drum solo. Dr. Sacks hypothesized that he had Tourette's because the inhibitory signals originating from his cortex were not traveling back down to the limbic system because he did not have enough neurotransmitters to transmit those neural signals. So, he gave Ray a drug called Haldol, known to result in the production of such neurotransmitters. Interestingly, and somewhat hilariously, it worked, but not without consequences. The next week, Ray came back in with a giant black eye. "So much for your effing Haldol," Ray said as he threw the pill bottle back at Dr. Sacks. "What happened?" Sacks asked. Tourette's patients are especially jittery and have an affinity for spinning things. Ray had a habit of darting in and out of revolving doors when he came across them. His Tourette's gave him quick reflexes and he could do so with ease. But on the Haldol, he'd come across a revolving door, tried to dart in and out, and wham! It clobbered him in the face, giving him a black eye. Ray also now sucked at ping pong and had trouble playing the drums. He felt that in curing his Tourette's, he had somehow lost himself. The story has a happy ending. Ray was able to have the best of both worlds by taking Haldol during the week so he could keep his job and his marriage, but going off Haldol on the weekends so he could be a good jazz drummer and play excellent ping pong. But the point of the story is that Ray had no choice in the matter whether he twitched. His tics were completely involuntary. Just like you don't choose to breathe, Tourette's patients don't choose to tic. Of course, you can choose to hold your breath for a while, but you can't choose to completely stop breathing. In the same way, Tourette's patients can sometimes put off their tics for a while, but they can't choose to stop them completely. In fact, they often describe their tics in this way. Just like when you hold your breath, the longer they go without ticking, the more the impulse to tic increases. And just like you gasp for air after you hold your breath for a long time, they will often tic excitedly after holding off their tics for a while, like holding them off during an important business meeting. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, also known as OCD, has a similar explanation. Impulses for cleanliness and repetition are produced by more primitive centers in the brain, and the cortexes of those with OCD simply can't suppress the signal. These examples reveal that we are not free for a couple of reasons. First, even the normal human brain is a lot like a Tourette patient's brain. Our limbic system, the origin of all our emotions, is constantly sending signals to our frontal cortex, the rational decision centers of our brain, telling it what to do. The cortex can inhibit those signals to some degree, but the number of connections running from the limbic system to the cortex is far greater than the number of connections running back down from the cortex to the limbic system. There's not much it can do. Mainly what it does is follow the limbic system's suggestions and then go through a process of rationalization to convince itself that that's what it wanted to do in the first place. Plato used an analogy to describe how he thought of the relationship between our reason and emotions. Our emotions are like the horses that drive a chariot. They keep it moving. Our reason is like the chariot driver. It controls and directs the emotions and ultimately the body to do what it wants. And if it wants to stop them, it just pulls on the reins and they stop. But discoveries in neuroscience have taught us that a more apt analogy would be a child sitting on top of an elephant. Maybe the child can alter the course of the elephant a little by pulling on its ears, but ultimately that elephant is going wherever the hell it wants. The best the child can do is try to convince itself that wherever it ends up is where it wanted to be. But Tourette's syndrome also threatens free will by revealing how the normal brain works. Tourette's patients can't keep from ticking because they don't have enough neurotransmitters. But that means the rest of us don't tick only because we do have enough neurotransmitters. In the same way that the Tourette's patient's behavior is dictated by what we might call their brain structure, our behavior is dictated by our brain structure. We don't tick because our cortexes successfully send inhibitory signals. That our cortex successfully sends inhibitory signals is dictated by its structure. But it's not like the structure of our brain is within our control. Most of that structure is due to our genetics, and that is not within our control. And the rest of the structure is a result of our environment, how we are taught, the things we experience, and that's not within our control either. You might think that we can control our environment by choosing what situations to place ourselves in, but that just backs up the problem. The choices we make about our environment is just a result of our brain structure, which again is either a product of genetics or environment. Tracing it back, you will ultimately get to environments that you had no control over, like the environment you found yourself in as a baby, and you will realize that you actually have no free will. But maybe you think the decision centers of our brain, the parts that actually give rise to the conscious experience of making a decision, can produce truly free actions. Perhaps, somehow, their complexity preserves free will. But neuroscience has even deflated that notion. In the 1960s, the neuroscientists Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Luder Dieck discovered that if you measure brain activity before a decision occurs, you can actually see the processes that lead to the decision being made. And it turns out they happen before the decision is consciously made and have nothing to do with the part of the brain responsible for conscious decisions. They called it a readiness potential. And since then, their findings have been repeated and supported and reiterated in many ways. For example, in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet showed that the readiness potential occurs 0.35 seconds before a decision is consciously made. And further studies made things even worse for free will. In 2008, psychologist John Dylan Haynes performed an experiment in which people decided which button to push while watching a series of letters being displayed, and reported what letter was displayed while making their decision. Haynes found that unconscious parts of the brain were busy doing their work to bring about the eventual action seconds before the reported letter appeared, long before the conscious decision was made. Neuroscientist Itzhak Fried did a similar experiment where he observed neurons more directly and was not only able to see the brain unconsciously deciding what to do before the conscious decision was made, but was even able to predict the conscious decision before it was made with 80 to 90% accuracy. These results are astonishing. Even if you are not bothered by determinism or quantum randomness, or even that our actions are determined by the structure of your brain. If you think you are free, you've got to think that your conscious decisions play a causal role in the actions that you make. You've got to think that when your free will is exercised, you are consciously making a decision. Your consciousness is involved in decision making. Even if you're an epiphenomenalist and you don't think that mental events have any causal effect on the world, you've got to think that the part of your brain that gives rise to conscious decisions has to be the cause of your actions, at least if you're going to be free. But what these experiments seem to indicate is that your conscious decision is an afterthought. The real decision process is done by unconscious parts of the brain, and once they have done their work, they send a signal to the consciousness-producing part of the brain that gives you the conscious experience of making the decision. But the brain activity that produces that experience, or the parts of the brain that produce them, are not playing a role in determining what action you will take. The brain is literally creating the illusion of free will. Now, the fact that decisions about what button to choose are not free doesn't necessarily mean that more grandiose decisions about what to do with your life are not free. More experiments need to be done. And the results of these experiments we just talked about are challenged by some scientists. Personally, I think the experiments are good. For one thing, they cohere with what we already know about how the brain works. It takes a lot of time to process all the information that your brain receives. And it doesn't always receive that information in the right order. For example, sensory information from your toes takes longer to get to your brain than sensory information from your forehead because your feet are further away. Yet if you were to touch your foot to your forehead, you would feel it in your foot and your forehead at the same time. Why? Because the brain does not experience things in the order in which it receives them. In fact, much of the information your brain receives that could be translated into conscious experience isn't. Your brain does a lot of filtering and only attends to that which is important. As it receives information, it waits for other relevant information, and once it has enough, it puts it all together and then feeds that to conscious awareness. But all of that takes time. Truth be told, when you experience an event happening in the world, it actually happened about half a second ago. Your conscious awareness is roughly half a second behind the real world. But in many cases, decisions have to be made quickly. If the brain had to wait around for conscious experience, many decisions would likely come too late. We actually know that decisions about whether to dodge or catch something thrown at you, or whether to fight or flee at the sight of danger, are actually made by unconscious parts of the brain. It's more basic and quick, and it needs to be for survival. But it wouldn't be surprising, given what we know about the brain, that decisions are always made unconsciously, and conscious decisions are, quite literally, an afterthought. But everything we've discussed today assumes the libertarian